what I have here is our fourth scenario. And in this fourth scenario, I'm going to introduce circuit resistance training. Now, all through cardiovascular and respiratory physiology and up to now, I've said resistance training should be traditional. And what I meant by traditional was you do a set, and then you take a rest, and then you do a set, and then you take a rest. Now what we've got is something, I'm just going to bring this down. We've got something that's much more continuous in nature. Okay? So Justin is my example exercise guinea pig in this scenario. And with circuit resistance training, if you have some experience with that, what that entails is doing a set of one exercise and then immediately moving to another exercise and performing a set. So you're trying to minimize the rest in between those things. Maybe there's like 5 seconds as you're transitioning, but it's fairly continuous. So it might look like a set of squats, going into a set of push-ups, going into a set of pull-ups, going into a set of abdominal stuff, going back into a set of squats and push-ups. Like you just keep lifting and there's minimal rest. That's what circuit resistance training is. And circuit resistance training as a mode of resistance training really blurs the lines between aerobic and traditional resistance training responses. It's something here in the middle. And so that's the new element for our scenario today, is we're going to see how would we describe the responses for something that blurs the lines. Now, there's a fatigue element in play as well, just so that we can continue to practice that layer that I introduced in the last scenario. Okay? So you can see that he's intending to perform this circuit for 15 minutes. The intensity at the beginning is hard. So hard being well above lactate threshold. Another word for hard could be high. And sort of the subcontext here is that even though it begins hard, it quickly feels like a maximal intensity as the workout continues. His muscles become progressively weaker, aka fatigue, right? Especially we'll be coming back to that again in lab this week. His muscles become progressively weaker with each set of exercise, and it becomes harder to maintain his force output, so the loads that he's lifting go down, right? So all of this should be just flashing brightly at you. Fatigue, 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 okay? Last but not least, he's cool and he's well hydrated. So recall with the CV drift thing, usually if someone's cool, well hydrated, and or not sweating much, you would only really think about that as a contextual layer if our time point was 60 minutes or greater, right? In this case, we're well short of 60 minutes. There's nothing here environmentally that suggests CV drift should be in play, so I don't think we have to consider that in this scenario. Cool? All right, so let's go ahead and see what those acute responses would look like then. So you can see that I've already filled in a couple things for metabolism, and that's because with metabolism, our onset and our post-exercise responses never change, right? So I pre-filled those. During a course, that can change a little bit. What I want to do is fill out the stuff that might be a little more unique to this scenario. His exercise intensity is hard. What we've done thus far is we have talked through the language to describe neuromuscular recruitment for an easy intensity, a moderate intensity, and with Dr. Abby's scenario on Monday, a hard intensity. But granted, the hard part was during. She had started at moderate and then it became hard. Now we're starting hard, but that doesn't change the language you would use. So the agreed upon language that we're going to have to describe neuromuscular recruitment for a hard intensity is that Justin is recruiting all of his type 1, all of his type 2A, and let's just say some or a few of those type 2X. So he's doing all type 1, all 2A, some are a few type 2X motor units. And just, I know it sounds like a broken record, but I want to make sure it's clear. You couldn't do like some of this and some of this and some of this. Based on those neuromuscular recruitment principles that we learned a long time ago, you have to use all the type 1s before you ever even tap into the 2As. You have to use all these before you ever tap into any of these, right? So it's important that you would say all this and this before you ever even write something about that. Okay? And what we had talked about with Dr. Abbey for a hard intensity is that rate coding could be described as fast. So I think that what you see right here is a really good descriptor of hard or high intensity. For metabolism, as you can see, since it's just the first few seconds, and his immediate system's dominant, of course, ATP and creatine phosphate would be our dominant fuels. We see enhanced glycolytic activity occurring, and he's using his stored oxygen on myoglobin to support an increasing mitochondrial respiration. On the CV and respiratory sides, because he's moving in these first few seconds, the exercise pressor reflex should be in play, which means due to increased sympathetic output, a lot of stuff's going to go up. Here's where we start to blur the lines a little bit. Remember that with resistance training, basically everything goes up. But with aerobic training, everything goes up except diastolic blood pressure. In this case, because of the continuity of circuit resistance training, you're going to assume that there's always a muscular contraction that's in play, which means that your CV responses should model what you would typically put for resistance training. In this case, I'm going to put increasing heart rate, stroke volume, ejection fraction, cardiac output, rate pressure product, systolic blood pressure. I'm going to include diastolic blood pressure, mean arterial pressure, SVR, and systemic vasoconstriction. Right? So this is exactly what you would have seen in scenario 2 for traditional resistance training. We're doing that here as well because there is a resistance element. And it's a continuous resistance element, right? You should assume these always contracting as muscles. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. On the respiratory side, as you've seen with pretty much any scenario thus far, everything goes up. But we have to describe how the ventilation is increasing. Is it a proportionate increase or a disproportionate increase? So I'm just going to put increasing ventilation. And remember, our mark to look for really is that intensity. In this case, hard, which is well above lactate threshold, should correspond with a disproportionately increasing ventilation. So I'm just going to put disproportionately here. And for reminder's sake, again, when I'm saying proportionate or disproportionate, what I'm really referring to is a trend. So if ventilation was increasing at a linear rate, I would call that proportionate. And if it was increasing curvilinearly like this, I would call that disproportionate. So proportionate, disproportionate. And what we had talked about before is this is basically at or below lactate threshold and above lactate threshold, right? So when you see that context in the scenario, that should help. Okay? Did you have a question, Liz? Oh, I saw that. I wasn't sure if you were okay. Cool. All right, so we see that ventilation is increasing proportionately, and then everything else, breathing frequency, tidal volume, and bronchodilation should all be increasing as well. Very typical of the scenarios we've discussed. Cool? All right, so let's skip ahead 14 minutes, and we're now into this 15-minute circuit resistance program. I mean, he's almost done. And if you look at the context, we can see that fatigue is occurring. When we talked about fatigue in scenario 3, Dr. Abbey had started with moderate, and it began to feel hard. So what we did is we basically added in more motor units, and we made sure to mention that the rate coding was faster here than there to indicate fatigue had occurred, right? In this case, Justin was starting at a higher intensity. So fatigue's occurring, and we have to figure out, well, how do we make this look like it's more than something that's already near the top? And this is partly why I like to have certain agreed upon language. All type 1, all type 2A, some or a few type 2X. I've left some room for us to add to the mix. So in this case, because of fatigue, let's just say that at this point, Justin is recruiting everything. All type 1, all type 2A, and all type 2X motor units, right? And it sounds like even in that case, it's not enough because his loads are starting to drop. You know, he is significantly fatigued. That doesn't mean he's not trying to recruit everything. Does that make sense? And he was at a fast rate coding, right? Let's assume that maybe it could go a little bit higher. So you could use one or two terms. Maybe you say faster rate coding, meaning faster than that. Or what if we just called it maximal rate coding because the intensity feels like maximal intensity? There's always a little bit of wiggle room there. So now what I can see is a change. This is usually what I want to see in the fatigue scenarios. I can see a change from this to that, right? It's not so much that this specific language is what you would use for anything that's fatigue oriented. The language in a cell should reflect the intensity at that time point, right? The language from here to there, that's what reflects fatigue. Does that make sense? So in Beth's case, we had less motor units written here and less written there, but there was a difference, right? And in Justin's case, more than Beth, still more than Beth, right? Make sense? Yeah? Okay. So let's get into our dominant system then. So this is an interesting one. With traditional resistance training, what I had described before was that we should focus on the exercise portion, right, during the set. And in that particular case, the dominant system was the immediate system, right? However, there isn't really a resting phase or resting time period with circuit resistance training. You're always contracting your muscles. And what that means is the loads that you would be able to lift continuously for 14, 15 minutes are going to be much lower than what you would expect for a traditional resistance training program, right? This is definitely a more endurance-oriented thing. And as such, because of the continuous nature and because of the lower intensity of it, our dominant system here is mitochondrial respiration. Now, it probably wouldn't feel like that to him. He would probably feel like his immediate system was dominant or his glycolytic system was dominant. But the reality is that because of that continuous nature, you would think of this more aerobically. Again, we're blurring the lines with circuit resistance training. Okay. Now, because he's high intensity, I guarantee you he is close to his VO2 max, right? His dominant fuel is certainly carbohydrates, which you could abbreviate as CHOs. You can call it carbs, carbohydrates, glucose, G6P, glycogen. Any of those, I would say, okay, they're thinking carbohydrates, right? He is certainly well past lactate threshold. And that should be your indication that carbs are the dominant fuel source. Now, because there is a fatigue thing, we're going to describe that carbohydrate metabolism as elevated but increasing, just like we did for Dr. Abby. So I'm going to put an E and a B followed by an upward arrow. And our two processes that I'd like to focus on here are glycogenesis. So we're making new glycogen. Glycogenesis and glycogenolysis. We're making that new glycogen just so we can break it back down. Okay. So in scenarios 1 and 2 where fatigue wasn't occurring, we described this as elevated but stable. But now in your 2 fatigue scenarios, you can see that's elevated but increasing. And because he's well above lactate threshold, I think the focal point for the lactate and protons is that they're accumulating in the muscles, right? No doubt he's still shuttling it out as fast as he can, but there's some accumulation, and that's where I want to direct attention. So we'll say that lactate and protons are accumulating in muscles. I think before I just said La and H plus accumulation in muscles. That's the same. You can word it a little bit differently if you need to. We still on the same page? Is it making sense? Yeah. So now we look at our CV responses. Here, the decision was made that these should model resistance training because of the resistance component of circuit resistance training. Same decision should be made here. And in that case, everything should be elevated. But it's going to be elevated but stable, right? I did not want to blur that with fatigue last time. So we would call all of this, whoops, I used the wrong thing. It's an upward arrow for elevated, followed by BS, elevated but stable. And I'll put heart rate, stroke volume, ejection fraction, cardiac output, rate pressure product, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, mean arterial pressure, it's a long list, systemic vasoconstriction, and I think that rounds them out in terms of the elevated but stable components. The one last thing we need to acknowledge is that EDRFs have been released and are prompting some local vasodilation, but the only reason, I left one out, I'm sorry, SVR should be in there. Only reason SVR is going up is because it's a resistance thing. Even though there's vasodilation that's occurring, muscle compression is almost creating like an artificial vasoconstriction, right? So we still have to acknowledge that the EDRFs are doing their thing. EDRFs elicit local VD, local vasodilation. Okay? And on the respiratory side, this is something that would change due to the fatigue element. So I'm going to have basically 3 categories. I'll have elevated but increasing. I'll have elevated but decreasing. And I'm going to have elevated but stable. So anytime you're in a fatiguing situation, it's reasonable to expect ventilation to be elevated but increasing. And remember, anytime ventilation is increasing, we have to describe that increase as proportionate or disproportionate. We're still above lactate thresholds. So that means that ventilation would be elevated but increasing in a disproportionate fashion. Okay. And what I also focused on last class was that in order for ventilation to continue to increase, that tends to be driven by breathing frequency. You'll see that little bolded note in your Ninja notes. So I'm going to put breathing frequency in this elevated but increasing list. However, as breathing frequency starts to speed up, now we start to see a hit in tidal volume. Those breaths get a little bit smaller. So they're still elevated compared to what they were before, but they're starting to go down a little bit. So I'm going to put tidal volume in this elevated but decreasing category. And bronchodilation is still as maximal as it can be. So we're going to call that elevated but stable. Okay. So this, in blue then, reflects our fatigue contextual layer. And post-exercise, you can see there's nothing to describe neuromuscularly because Justin's done at this point. He's just hanging out. Metabolically, we've got EPOC going on, so mitochondrial respiration is decreased compared to exercise, but increased compared to rest. There's increased gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of new glucose, and glycogenesis, which is the formation of new glycogen. This is all in an attempt to help get a jump start on replenishment of the carbs that were depleted here. And this accumulation of lactate and protons gets shuttled out of the muscles, right? So same as any other scenario. On the CV side, this is simple because everything was elevated, right? So all we have to do now is simply say decrease compared to exercise, but increase compared to rest, and then we just write out our list. In this case, heart rate, stroke volume, ejection fraction, cardiac output, rate pressure product, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, mean arterial pressure, systemic vascular resistance, and systemic vasoconstriction. It's all going down, right? But just remains a little bit elevated. And the same thing is going to be the case for all of our respiratory parameters. Everything was elevated, so now it's going to come down post-exercise. So decreased C2E, increased C2R, ventilation, tidal volume, breathing frequency, and bronchodilation. And that's it.